Twofold Bay on the far south coast of New South Wales, Australia. By the 1840s, no one wrote down the year, the killer whales were already cooperating with the whalers at Twofold Bay, decades before the Davidson family arrived. They would find a humpback or a right whale passing up the coast, surround it, and drive it into the bay, away from the open ocean, where a whale that size could never be taken with hand-thrown harpoons. Then one or two of them would peel off, swim to the whaling station, and breach, throwing 5 tons of black and white at the water over and over, until the Davidson family launched their boats. The humans did the killing, the orcas took the tongue. For 3 generations, this arrangement held. The whalers called it the law of the tongue, and they abided by it even when it cost them money, anchoring a carcass overnight so the pod could feed before the whale was towed in. Among documented hunting partnerships between humans and wild predators, this one stands alone in its precision, its duration, and its named rules. The pod's most famous member was a 22-foot male the whalers called Old Tom. And, on a day in September 1930, George Davidson found his body floating in Twofold Bay. This is how the contract worked, and why it died with him. For nearly a century, in one Australian bay, orcas and humans ran a joint whaling operation under explicit, honoured rules that both parties maintained across 3 generations. That arrangement is the clearest evidence we have that the killer whale's famous restraint toward people is cultural. A system of rules, relationships, and memory passed down through generations rather than instinct, indifference, or luck. Twofold Bay sits roughly 400 kilometres south of Sydney and 40 north of the Victorian border. George Bass named it in 1798 for its shape, 2 folds, 2 bites. Kai Bay to the north, Nullika Bay to the south, dividing an open oceanic embayment whose projecting headlands and enclosed inner geometry have earned it a specific distinction, the 3rd deepest natural harbour in the southern hemisphere. The bay covers 30.7 square kilometres, reaches an average depth of 10.9 metres, and receives the Toowoomba and Nullika rivers from the west, while opening east to the Tasman Sea between the headlands at North Head and Red Point. A volcanic inner formation, Middle Head, cuts the bay further into 2 distinct sections. The result is a large body of relatively sheltered water, deep close to shore, enclosed on 3 sides, with a single manageable entrance, a geography purpose-built for trapping large animals that had made the mistake of swimming inside. The humpback whales come twice a year. They stream north past Eden from May through July, heading for warmer breeding grounds. They return south from August through November, following the same coastal corridor back toward the Antarctic. That route, now called the Humpback Highway by marine researchers, runs directly past Twofold Bay. During spring, humpbacks come right into the bay to feed and nurse their calves in the protected shallows, as they still do today. Southern right whales use the bay too. It's one of just 12 coastal aggregation areas for right whales in all of Australia. For a whaler working from a rowing boat with a hand-thrown harpoon, that geography was the difference between possible and impossible. A 40-ton humpback in open ocean was untouchable. It would sound, drag the line taut, and pull the boat until the crew cut free or capsized. A whale inside Twofold Bay, in 11 meters of water with headlands on 3 sides and no room to run faster than a rowing crew could steer, was a whale a hand harpoon could kill. The bay was a containment zone. The whales entered it voluntarily for the food, the shelter, the nursing grounds. The orcas exploited that geography, herding the baleen whales toward the inner shallows where the rowboats could close the gap. The trap had 3 components: the shape of the land, the seasonal habits of the whales, and the intelligence of the killers. Before the Davidsons arrived, before the Tri-Works, before any European harpoon reached this water, the Thawa people of the Yuin nation had been living that geography for generations. The Thawa are the coastal clan of the Yuin Nation, the First Nations people whose country stretches along this section of the New South Wales south coast. Their name for Twofold Bay is Turembulera. In their knowledge, and this is living oral tradition carried by named custodians, not quantified by archaeology, the killer whale is a Beowa, and the Beowas are kin. Stephen Holmes, a Thawa traditional custodian, wrote those words into the foreword of a 2023 peer-reviewed genetic study of the Eden orcas. We consider Beowas, killer whales, to be our brothers. He continued, our Dreamtime stories which connect us to the Beowas is that when a Thawa member dies, they are reincarnated as a Beowa. The Beowas remained part of the Thawa even after passing. In Thawa oral tradition, the orca's black and white markings were the pattern of a corroboree dancer, the colours and shapes of warriors and whalers who had died and come back to the sea. The Thawa always remained one mob, whether whale or man. That kinship had practical expression in the hunt. Thawa oral tradition describes cooperative hunting with structured rules. Singers on shore called the Beowas in. The orcas herded baleen whales toward the shallows, the people speared them, and the tongue went to the Beowas in payment. A Thawa ancestor named Budginbro is remembered in the tradition as the one whose practice of offering the tongue gave the arrangement its name. The 2023 Journal of Heredity study, which fused genetics with Thawa custodial knowledge, notes that Indigenous Australians maintained what the paper calls an ongoing mutualistic interaction with the killer whales before European colonization, working in unison with the orcas, on shore and in the water, until a carcass was ready to be shared. An early ethnographic account from 1904, cited in the same study, describes Thawa people singing to encourage the killer whales to herd baleen whales close inshore. The Unes Wales National Park's interpretive text for Beowa National Park, renamed from Ben Boyd National Park in September 2022, using the Thawa word for killer whale, states the historical sequence plainly. Aboriginal people taught European settlers how to work with the orcas. The park's very name is a form of attribution. Documented cooperative hunts between orcas and European whalers at Eden appear in the written record from the early 1840s, more than a decade before the Davidson family established itself at Keir Inlet. The Davidsons didn't invent the law of the tongue, they entered it. Alexander Walker Davidson arrived in New South Wales in the early 1840s, a cabinet maker from Aberdeen with no whaling in his blood. He went to work for Benjamin Boyd, the London stockbroker who had poured a fortune into Twofold Bay, building a coastal shipping line, buying roughly 3 million acres of grazing land, and establishing whaling stations at what he imagined would be the great commercial port of the Southern Hemisphere. Boyd's empire collapsed. When the wreckage was liquidated, Alexander Davidson bought Boyd's whaling equipment at a deep discount and, around 1857, established a station at Keir Inlet at the mouth of the Toowoomba River on the southern shore of the bay. He built his try-works, brick furnaces for rendering blubber, on a sandy beach where whale carcasses could be hauled directly onto shore. The Davidson whaling station at Keir Inlet became the longest operating shore-based whaling station in Australia and the last of its kind to close. That longevity rested almost entirely on the Orca partnership, and the partnership required keeping the technology marginal. Alexander and his son John ran 5- and 7-oared open rowing boats, human-powered, low-profile, quiet. The harpoons were thrown by hand. In 1906, George Davidson, Alexander's grandson, purchased a single motor launch, the station's only concession to modern machinery across its entire history. They did own a bomb lance gun. A 1909 photograph shows Charlie Davidson posed with harpoons, lances, and the device. A historical study of Australian whaling technology records that the gun was owned by George Davidson, but was seldom used as it was said to frighten the killer whales which assisted the hunts. Explosive ordnance stayed off the boats for the orcas' comfort. Deliberately primitive technology was a management choice, not a poverty of ambition. That wasn't an insult. It was an accurate description of a station that had survived 80 years of fluctuating markets and declining whale numbers by doing one thing no modern operation could replicate: maintaining a working relationship with a wild animal. At peak, the station took 10 to 15 whales per season. 3 generations ran its operations: Alexander, then John Simpson Davidson, then George Davidson, born in Eden in May 1863 and whaling by the age of 14. In 1896, George built the weatherboard cottage called Loch Garra on 17 acres of leasehold land above the try-works. The crews that boarded his rowing boats included Aboriginal whalers, men whose families had been working this bay with the Beowas long before Alexander Davidson ever purchased Boyd's old gear. The station's records suggest that those Indigenous crew members refused to allow any mistreatment of the Orcas, an enforcement mechanism that helped hold the protocol intact on the human side of the arrangement. The pod that worked with the Davidsons numbered roughly 50 animals across 3 main sub-pods. Up to 30 individuals were recognizable by their dorsal fins and had been named, and the Davidsons, like the Thawa before them, named most of the Orcas after people who had died. Stranger, Jackson, Hookie, Humpy, Cooper, Typee, Big Ben, Young Ben, Kincher, Old Tom. The Thawa believed the dead returned as Beowas. The Davidsons named Orcas after their dead. The theology was different. The instinct was the same. The hunt itself was organized along consistent roles. When the pod located a baleen whale on the migration route, it deployed as a unit. The Eden Killer Whale Museum records and the 2023 Journal of Heredity study both describe the same pattern. One group of orcas blocked the whale's escape into open ocean, a second dove beneath the animal to prevent it from sounding into deep water, and a third conducted the attack, biting the fins and flukes to destroy propulsion, leaping onto the whale's back and over its blowhole to restrict breathing, and forcing the animal's mouth open to steer it toward the bay's shallow inner waters. A contemporary observer's account preserved in later historical sources described what happened once the whale was trapped. Any attempt the whale made to reach open sea, the killers resented with full energy, snapping at it continuously, keeping it contained until the rowboats arrived. Then the signal. 1 or 2 orcas broke off from the hunt and swam to the Kia River mouth, right beside the Davidson cottages, and performed what witnesses called flop-tailing, hurling themselves out of the water or slapping their tails against the surface over and over until the men on shore came running. The Royal Society of Biology, in a study of killer whale social behavior, documented the night alerts in specific detail. Whalers were roused from their slumber by the resounding lobtailing of killer whales, with the tail slaps echoing like rifle shots through the stillness of the night. On shore, the sound triggered the old whaleman's cry of "Rusho" and a sprint for the boats. The signaling happened at the Kia River mouth and nowhere else along the shoreline. Multiple accounts across decades report that the pod recognized the Davidsons' green rowing boats and distinguished them from the white boats of their competitors. This is family testimony and local record rather than a controlled experiment, but it is consistent and spatially specific. The alert went to one location, associated with one family, not broadcast along the full shore. Modern orca research establishes that killer whales recognize individual vessels acoustically and visually at considerable distances, which makes the claimed behavior biologically plausible. The whalers had no science to explain it. They simply observed it, season after season, and acted accordingly. Once the boats reached the whale, the orcas remained active. Eyewitnesses reported that some grabbed the harpoon ropes in their teeth and helped tow the rowboats toward the target. The same ropes, handled the same way across hundreds of hunts, wore the right side of one orca's teeth into a smooth, distinctive groove. That animal was Old Tom, and the groove is still visible in his skeleton today. When a whale was harpooned and died, the killer's hunting work ended. Their payment began. The law of the tongue had 2 parts. The first was what the orcas received. the tongue and lips of every baleen whale taken in a cooperative hunt. The whalers anchored or buoyed the carcass in the bay after the kill, often overnight, sometimes for 24 hours or longer, and the killers fed before the humans towed the carcass in for processing. The blubber, the bone, the baleen, precisely the parts the humans needed, were left almost entirely untouched. A 1991 review in the journal Mammal Review established that Southern Hemisphere killer whales consistently prefer the tongue and lips of baleen whales as their selective cut. The Eden payment matched a documented species-wide feeding preference. The orcas were receiving their preferred portion of a shared kill, reserved in advance by the rules of the arrangement. The second part was the human obligation, honoring the payment even at a cost. Anchoring a dead whale overnight in an open bay meant lost processing time, exposure to weather, potential oil degradation, real money in a marginal business. The Davidsons anchored it anyway. A 2023 paper in the journal People and Nature recorded that at Twofold Bay, up to 30 individually identifiable orcas cooperated with humans, and the humans allowed the orcas to feed on the tongue before harvesting the remainder. Across decades, through good seasons and bad, the rule held on both sides. The phrase "law of the tongue" appears first in print in a 1908 newspaper article that drew on direct interviews with George Davidson. Tom Mead's 1961 book, Killers of Eden, carried it to a general readership. Danielle Clode's 2002 history, Killers in Eden, traced how deep it ran. The 2023 Journal of Heredity study used the phrase as a technical descriptor. From the museum placard to the peer-reviewed literature, the sources call it what the Davidsons and the Tower before them called it. Enforcement lived in family testimony rather than archival records. Whalers who didn't honor the payment found the pod suddenly absent or indifferent. The signaling stopped, the cooperative herding disappeared. The orcas could withdraw. A whaling family that broke the law of the tongue didn't lose a business partner, it lost the business. That asymmetry explains why the Davidsons absorbed the cost of overnight anchoring without apparent complaint across 3 generations. They couldn't afford to do otherwise. The most famous of the Eden orcas measured 6.7 meters, 22 feet, and weighed 6 tons. His dorsal fin was tall and distinctive, with a bend at the top to the right, visible at a distance across flat water. The Eden Killer Whale Museum describes him as leader of one of the pods that herded passing whales into the bay. The Davidson family history traces him from the 1860s through to his death in September 1930, nearly 70 years of seasonal returns, which would make him extraordinarily old by any current estimate of orca longevity. Tooth ring aging has since been shown to become unreliable for older animals. What isn't in dispute is the span of human memory attached to him. 3 consecutive generations of the same whaling family all claim to have worked beside the same individual animal. The Davidson family called him a character. The name may derive from tomfoolery. His early nickname in the family diaries was Tom the Humorist. He would take an anchor line or a mooring rope in his teeth and tow small fishing boats around the bay for what all accounts describe as sheer sport. He played tug-of-war with the harpoon ropes during hunts, ripping the line and pulling against the crew, repeatedly, season after season, until the friction wore the right side of his teeth into a shallow, distinctive groove. The skeleton preserves that groove in bone. Those worn teeth are the physical evidence of a relationship, the record of hundreds of individual games, each one a choice the animal made, each one adding its increment of wear. The family history described him as an athletic and skillful whale hunter who happened to enjoy towing smaller boats by their anchor lines. George Davidson, who was a boy when Old Tom was in his prime and an old man by the time Old Tom died, had the deepest bond. George's relationship with the orca, by all accounts, mirrored the intimacy that Aboriginal whalers had always maintained with the Biawas. When Old Tom died, it was George who found the body, George who identified it, and George who prepared the skeleton. He had known the animal for as long as he could remember. The science behind all of this, The rules, the generational memory, the specific relationship between one family and one pod makes Eden more than a well-documented local story. Wild killer whales have never been confirmed to have killed a human being. Every documented human death caused by an orca has occurred in captivity. Across every ocean, across every century of human activity at sea, the record of confirmed fatal attacks by wild orcas on humans contains 0 entries. That is a remarkable fact for an animal that regularly kills creatures far larger than a person, whose teeth reach 13 centimeters in length, and whose social hunting strategy is among the most sophisticated of any predator on Earth. Killer whales exist in distinct cultural populations called ecotypes. In the North Pacific alone, researchers have identified resident ecotypes that eat salmon exclusively, transient ecotypes that hunt marine mammals, and offshore ecotypes whose diet centers on sharks. These populations don't interbreed. They maintain separate acoustic dialects, vocalizations that differ enough between groups that researchers can identify ecotypes by sound alone without seeing the animals. A fish-eating population does not switch to marine mammals when fish run scarce. The boundary is cultural, maintained through learning, not hardwired into the biology. What each ecotype does, it learned, from its mother, from its grandmother, from the matriarch who held the group's knowledge of where to travel and what to eat and how to behave toward other species. Those matriarchs are the storage mechanism. That is precisely the mechanism a century-long interspecies contract would require. Individuals who remember the terms and transmit them to the next generation. Orca alliances with other species are learned and specific too. The friendship isn't instinct, it's a standing arrangement, taught and maintained across years. The Eden orcas chose the green boats of the Davidsons. For generations, the pattern is consistent with what the species is known to do. Selective feeding makes the same point from a different angle. When orcas in South African and Australian waters attack great white sharks, they consume only the liver, an organ exceptionally dense in fats, and leave the carcass. The preference is consistent across multiple documented events, applied by different individuals, and transmitted within hunting groups. The tongue-first rule in Eden is the same category of behavior, a surgical preference for a specific part of a specific prey, applied consistently over decades, maintained across the deaths of individual animals. Feeding preference as cultural institution. The Eden contract sits within that framework. A killer whale population with social memory, matriarchal knowledge transmission, and the capacity for species-specific alliances runs a cooperative hunt with a human family for 3 generations. That is a documented instance of precisely the capabilities this species has. The pod began to thin in the 1920s. Stranger, who had led one of the main sub-pods from the mid-1800s into the early 1900s, was gone from the record by 1907. Hookie, the leader of the sub-pod to which Old Tom belonged, first recorded in the 1850s, was last seen in 1926. Humpy died around the same time. The baleen whale migration was under pressure too. Industrial whaling fleets operating offshore were working the same migration corridor that had supplied Twofold Bay for a century, and the numbers of humpbacks and right whales entering the bay dropped throughout the decade. The station caught 2 whales in the entire 1925 season. By 1929, the last whale of the era was taken at Twofold Bay. Whaling at Eden effectively ended before Old Tom died. The people of Eden at the time widely believed Norwegian whalers operating further north had killed the remaining pod members, unaware of the relationship they were ending. That belief was never conclusively proven. What is documented is the trajectory, roughly 50 orcas in the station's active years, dwindling through the 1910s and 1920s until a single animal returned alone to a bay with no baleen whales and no pod. Old Tom kept coming back. Photographs from those final years show the same tall, right-bent dorsal fin beside the boats in seasons when there was nothing to hunt. Killer whales in the wild are intensely social animals, rarely seen alone for extended periods. He returned anyway, season after season, to a place that had once been the center of his working life. In September 1930, George Davidson found Old Tom's body floating in the southern part of Twofold Bay. George's first instinct was to tow the body out to sea. A friend argued against it. George and his son brought the carcass to the Kia Tri-Works, prepared the skeleton, and in 1931, the Eden Killer Whale Museum opened with Old Tom as its founding exhibit. His skeleton is made up of 250 individual bones. He weighed 6 tons and measured 22 feet. His teeth, the right side worn into the groove from rope games repeated over decades, are visible in the display. In April 2024, conservators disassembled the skeleton for the first time in nearly 4 decades, corrected decades of small anatomical errors, and rehung the bones from the ceiling of the museum so that visitors now walk in and see Old Tom swimming toward them. The museum receives 50,000 visitors a year. A 2023 Flinders University genetic study sequenced Old Tom's DNA against databases of killer whale populations worldwide. His lineage was distinctive, with possible links to Antarctic ecotype populations. No clear living descendants appeared in any population sampled. The study, whose foreword was written by Stephen Holmes, the tower custodian for whom the Beowas are brothers, concluded that the Eden hunting pod is now locally extinct. The Beowas of Turumbalera, the brothers of the tower, the pod that worked beside the green rowing boats through 3 human generations, are gone. One caveat worth stating plainly: the claim that Eden represents the only documented hunting alliance between humans and a wild predator overstates the case. The cast net fishermen of Laguna in southern Brazil have cooperated with wild bottlenose dolphins for generations. A partnership documented in peer-reviewed science, studied by biologists, and confirmed to transmit culturally across multiple dolphin generations. What makes Eden singular is the species. No other apex predator of the open ocean, nothing remotely comparable in size and hunting capacity to an orca, has ever been documented joining a human hunt and accepting payment. The scale and the specificity of the Eden arrangement, the named rules, the overnight anchoring, the 3 human generations, the identified individual animals, place it in a category of its own. There is a small museum in Eden, Australia, where you can stand in front of the only documented orca-human hunting partnership ever preserved in bone. It hangs from the ceiling. 22 feet of skeleton, teeth worn flat from a lifetime of pulling ropes in games with the boats. The whalers kept the law of the tongue until the end, and the orcas kept showing up until there was no one left to show up for. We spend a lot of time asking why orcas don't harm us. Eden suggests the question is backwards. They were never keeping their distance. They were keeping their word. Which orca culture story should we document next? The vote is in the comments. Subscribe for more stories like this one.